We have a half-hour programme on Channel 4 News tonight. We have North Korea to cover, we have another special on Thatcher, we're looking ahead to the funeral next week. You know, we've got all these things. Print, I say print, I mean written media can sometimes expand, particularly websites can expand infinitely to fit more news in. Papers, magazines, a bit less so, but still there's expansion. Channel 4 News, no, that's it. You've got 50 minutes on a normal day and that's it. We also prioritise breaking news. So your carefully crafted press release that you sent out to journalists in the morning, if you sent out your press release on Monday morning this week, cat in hell's chance it's going to end up on Channel 4 News in the evening. Do you see what I mean? We prioritise breaking news because it makes us different to what you heard on the Today programme in the morning. That's why we're obsessed with breaking news. Breaking news will often force out other stories that I try and do. So again, I've got to come up with a story that's impactful and that will compete with any breaking news. Technology news, phenomenally hard for another reason, pictures. There are no pictures of technology news. Did the lights go out or did I just have a stroke? No, hang on. I thought that was a sort of signal for just get off, you've had enough. No, so basically technology, the idea with TV news is you're meant to be able to follow the story with the sound down. That's a classic sort of, for those who don't know, TV trick. You turn the sound off and if you can follow the story, you know, they're happy with that. So, you know, the example in Syria, you know, you have a guy in sandals with an RPG firing at a tank. You don't have to have commentary on top of that. You know there's an inappropriately dressed man for combat firing at something which is far senior to him. It tells the story. It's the insurgent movement against the government. That's the story right there. Technology, you've got one man at a computer and another man at a computer. And you think, now that could describe a hacking incident. You know, he could be hacking into his computer, or he could be teaching him how to code, or he could be sending him an email. You have no idea. So thinking in terms of picture is the main challenge. And with technology, it's a big challenge because technology doesn't generally have that many pictures. So part of my remit is to work out, you know, how we actually illustrate the stories. So there are, you may get an impression from this that I never get a story in that. I do, you know, honestly I do. But to give you an example, my most recent story, big story, was Yahoo got hacked. Their email service got hacked and it was used to send out spam links. Some of you guys are quite interested in as well. And we managed to actually find the guy who was doing it. You know, all our evidence went off to the FBI, they shut down his servers in California. You know, our investigation triggers FBI sting. Pretty good, right? You know, that got on air by luck because there was an IT failure that meant one of the other stories couldn't get on. So even when I trigger an FBI sting, that's just about good enough to make it a Channel 4 News. That's the kind of bar I'm talking about. Okay, so I don't want to, you know, I will tell it like it is. It is very difficult to do. Other stories we've had, we did an investigation into internet dating last year. I've got a whistleblower who worked for one of the big companies who actually ran a team of fakers on internet dating. So they set up fake accounts to try and get people in and string people along for years at a time, you know, sad people who didn't get on dates. That triggered a trading standards investigation. We did a story on contactless cards, the swipe cards that you can pay for things with. Turns out those cards broadcast in the clear, and using a standard mobile phone you can sweep the card in somebody's wallet or pocket and pick up their card details. You can then use it on Amazon and buy goods and get them delivered to an address that's not that of the cardholder. Again, that's an Information Commissioner's investigation. We did a story about how to break into BMWs, which they don't have a metal key anymore, they have a piece of plastic that you put in a slot and you press start. You can recode the piece of plastic and drive the car away. But because there's no sign of a break-in, BMW, the insurers weren't reimbursing people for their BMWs being nicked. And again, that triggered a product recall. So you get the idea, there's a story that's impactful, that has an effect on real people, and that also, hopefully thereafter, triggers something like an investigation or recall or something like that. That's generally what we're aiming for. It's a pretty high bar. I'm not saying every story we do comes back to that, but that's what we're particularly aiming for. In terms of the news you can use, the question for you guys is hands up if you're PR people who are actually approaching journalists. Hands up if you're actually a PR person. Not that many. If you don't have a PR department and you're thinking about, you know, should you try and get on, not into TV news particularly, but news in general, you have to ask yourself, particularly these days, is that the right way to go? We're not the gatekeepers anymore. We're not, you know, you can publish yourselves, you can put something on YouTube, create your own channel for news, I don't care. Twitter, Facebook, blogs, and more than anybody else, you guys know how to drive traffic and how to attract people to that. And you retain control over the message there. I mean, the nightmare is, you know, you work with a journalist on a story, and they go off and do something themselves, and it doesn't bear any relation to what you originally had planned out, and that does happen. If you do it yourself, you regain control over it, and you can keep control over it. And if you are looking into, content producing, there are so many channels that you can do that for. The question, I guess, is for you, if you're trying to create stuff that seems authentic, or is authentic in terms of journalism, how do you actually do that? And I know that lots of people are hiring journalists in to do that. There are advantages, though, to going with traditional media. One of the main ones, obviously, is credibility. If you get on Channel 4 News, if you get on our website, it is a trusted source of news. And this goes back to what the Google guys were talking about. I imagine that if you're, if there's mentions on Channel 4 News, if there's links on Channel 4 News, it will stand you in good stead. So if you're trying to go down the traditional media route, there's a few questions that you need to have in your mind that you should be trying to answer because the journalists will ask them. The first one is knowing which stories to target. Not every story is going to work on news, generally, and not every story is going to work on TV news. So you should try and pick your target. Which stories do you think you've got coming up that you think will work? It's hugely costly in terms of resource and time and so on for Channel 4 News to do a story. Not everything that you come out with is actually going to be attractive or even doable. The second thing is think in pictures. Very, very important to think in pictures, because the first thing I'll ask is, well, what are we actually going to point to camera at? And this is why we're obsessed with case studies. PR people get really furious about it. Why do you always want a case study? The reason we always want a case study is it gives us something to point a camera at. So instead of having man sitting at the computer, another man sitting at the computer, we can go round to Mrs. Jones's house and we can see her logging in and being hacked, how that hack happened, or we can see her using the particular business tool that we're trying to explain. You can actually see somebody in the real world using it. And that's the other thing, is where does your story hit the real world? The vast majority of Channel 4 News viewers, they're not at the cutting edge. I mean, this conference would be bewildering to them. So you've got to explain, where does your story actually hit the real world? Where does it really impact on people? Case studies will do that. Case studies of businesses will do that. And again, if you're writing copy or writing content, writing about real people, having real examples, will cement your example in the real world. It will give it a framework, and people will find it much easier to understand. This comes into another point, which is the best TV news stories about people, because people like people. We like watching people. It's a facile example, but in the traditional fairy tale, you've got the sort of princess in the castle, beautiful princess, and the evil prince, and the good prince comes and rescues you, and so on. What you don't see in that fairy tale is the castle walls were 2 meters thick, it had a drawbridge of 15 meters, and there were 17 sharks in the moat. Because nobody cares. You care about the beautiful princess. She's a beautiful princess. She's a person. You can identify it. And so the reason we call a news story, that word, story, isn't just chosen at random. It has a beginning, a middle, and end, and it has real people in it. And that's what you need to look for, is what's the real person's story in this, and how can I illustrate this with a real world example? And it's not always easy. I know it's not always easy, and that's part of my job and part of my headache. The other thing is we're regulated by Ofcom. Channel 4 News, all TV news is regulated by Ofcom, and we have rules that we have to obey, and one of them is undue prominence. There's a rule which means we can't plug products, basically. So if you have your product or a client's product, and you come to us and say, this is great, we can't put it out, we will get fined. My favourite example of this is there was an ITV regional news programme. It must have been in East Anglia somewhere, because it was about narrowboats. There's a guy who ran a narrowboat rescue service, like the AA of the waterways. And he went out in his little boat and fixed other people's boats. They did a piece on it, this guy going out. And one of the other narrowboat repair services complained to Ofcom and said, you featured Brian, you haven't featured me. And Ofcom agreed, and they fined the broadcaster. They actually got fined tens of thousands of pounds. And the terrifying thing for me about that was I can imagine doing that. I can imagine I've been a local news editor on local TV, and you just think, oh, it's great, Sunday, there's no news about, let's go out on a narrowboat. And they got fined. So you can very easily trip this line between undue prominence and regular news. If you've got either your service or client service or whatever, and you're trying to work out, does it deserve news coverage? The question is, does it tie into a bigger issue? So we can cover a particular business, we can cover a particular thing, but only in so much as it ties into a bigger issue. So if we do a piece about, let's say we do an economics piece and we talk about businesses trying to get bank loans, we will feature a business, that will feature as part of the piece. And that, you would think it's undue prominence, but no, because it ties into a bigger issue. That business is illustrative of a bigger issue. And that again comes back to the idea of using a case study. A case study is a good way in to a story. Yes, that case study gets undue prominence, but because they tie into a bigger issue. Does that make sense? Yeah, anyway. You can ask questions about it now. So I think that's about all I've got to say. Yeah, but I'm happy to take questions if anybody's got. Yeah.
So any questions for Geoff there about kind of getting on? I know one that I have that I think is interesting to ask. Do you think that when you're looking for kind of sources of people pitching you, do you tend to find that the PRs are best at it, or actually sometimes do you like to find the story yourself? See, to kind of go back to what you were talking about a little bit before, where people are making their own news, is there sometimes an additional credibility if that someone hasn't pitched you, and they could perhaps be doing it in a subtle way?
The thing that winds me up is when PR people pitch me a story and say, I think it should go like this. It's like, no, that's my job. Because they're always crap as well. The stories are always crap. But I don't mind hearing from the PR person in the first instance. But often, if I'm interested in the story, it'll be the person who runs the company who knows the answers. So I'll say to the PR person, well, what about this, this, and this? And they go, I don't know. So at that point, I need to actually chat to the person who runs the company. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, no, that's perfect. No, well, thanks so much there, Geoff. Really appreciate it. And a round of applause.